I'm going to show you 5 things from Cormac McCarthy's masterful dialogue that you can take to use in your own stories today. They are exposition, character voices, motivation, subtext, and movement. Maybe you've heard of every single one of those before, but there's a little more to it than you might expect. I'll give you examples of each of these aspects of dialogue writing from McCarthy's novel No Country for Old Men, and we'll figure out how he makes his dialogue feel so real and engaging. Let's start with something that a lot of new writers tend to fall down on, and that's exposition in dialogue. Exposition is basically background information for the scene or the story. It's all that stuff that the reader really needs to know to understand or appreciate what's happening. Often it's up front before the story even really begins, and we use it to tell the readers about the world of our story or the life of our character. Think, once upon a time, there lived a princess. But exposition can happen at any point in the story if there's something that the reader needs to know, and putting it into dialogue is a pretty common way of making it a little bit more engaging. All writers have heard show don't tell, but there's really no place where it's more relevant, in my opinion, than with exposition. It's really easy to stumble into using direct exposition in your dialogue, just getting your characters to spit out facts and just straight telling your reader what you want them to know. The problem is that can break a reader's immersion because you're kind of drawing attention to the fact that they're reading a fake conversation. I would much rather get that information from what I see and what's shown to me than just be directly told. So let's have a look at how McCarthy uses exposition in dialogue. In No Country for Old Men, the protagonist, Llewellyn Moss, stumbles onto the aftermath of a gunfight in the desert where a dying man asks him for a drink of water that he doesn't have. Later, he's back at home with his wife, Carla Jean, and he's disturbed by the fact that the man is still out there, suffering. And we don't really know that Llewellyn feels some type of way about this until McCarthy reveals it to us using dialogue. McCarthy has Llewellyn talk to both himself and his wife, and he uses exposition to let us into what Llewellyn is thinking and planning, to give us information that we don't already have. Here's what this dialogue could have looked like if McCarthy had approached it in a basic, obvious way. This is direct exposition. I feel guilty for leaving that man out there in the desert. I'm thinking about going back out there. This tells us what Llewellyn is thinking and what's really pushing him, but it feels really basic and kind of surface level. Because of that, it keeps the reader at arm's length from what the character is really feeling. But of course, that's not what McCarthy wrote. Instead, he used indirect exposition to show us what Llewellyn is really thinking and feeling in his dialogue as he sits up in bed in the dead of night. Are you dead out there? Hell no, you ain't dead. What's great about this is that it communicates the exact same message as the direct version, but it's in Llewellyn's own words, which makes it much more immersive and personal. Instead of just being sterile information that's handed to us, it's a scent for us to pick up and follow. And that trail continues on into the next scene where we're given some more dialogue that reveals what might be going on in Llewellyn's head. This time, he doesn't just speak to himself, he speaks to Carla Jean. And if this had been direct exposition, here's what it might have sounded like. I need to go and give the man in the desert some water, even though it's really dangerous and I might die. It is a really dangerous situation, but if this had been the dialogue, then I don't think the reader would have felt much mystery or much tension. It's surface level, so again, its impact is limited. Now here's the dialogue that McCarthy actually wrote, using indirect exposition, when Carla Jean asks Llewellyn what the hell's going on. I'm fixing to do something dumber than hell, but I'm going anyways. If I don't come back, tell mother I love her. I'm not going to attempt the accent, but the thing that strikes me most about this is that the personality of the character is up front in the dialogue, so much so that we don't even notice that we're being told what's about to happen. Even the obvious danger of what Llewellyn is about to do is packed away inside his flippant comment about his mother, who's already dead, by the way. If there's something you need to get across to your reader, try using exposition in your dialogue, but don't be too direct. Put the information in your character's words and keep a little something back so that it doesn't feel like you're just whispering instructions in your reader's ear. Sorry, I'm interrupting the main video for a second, but at least it's me and not an ad for Raid Shadow Legends. So, if you have a story that you're working on that you want to send to journals or to competitions, or if you've just started a novel and you want to know if you're on the right track, I'm now offering a developmental editing service on my website. I'll take a look at all the obvious stuff, the spelling and grammar, that kind of thing, but I'll also look at how the story works as a whole and how I think you can refine it or develop it. Then I'll give you a complete write-up with all of my suggestions and comments and advice. It doesn't matter what level of experience you have, I'll give you some friendly and actionable advice that you can put towards all of your future work as well. There's a QR code on screen and a link in the description if you want to go and check out prices and that kind of thing. Thank you so much for your patience. Back to the video. Of course, using exposition in your dialogue is much easier to pull off once you've already established distinct, individual character voices. McCarthy was a master of this, so much so that despite his quirk of never using quotation marks in his writing, you could still pretty much always tell which character was speaking in any conversation. To create a really recognisable character voice in your dialogue, you have to think about what your characters don't say as well as what they do, what their vocabulary is like, how they phrase things, and even the pace at which they talk. We're spoiled for choice in No Country for Old Men because every single character has an established voice that you can hear leaping off the page at you, but so that this video isn't 3 hours long, I've settled on Sheriff Bell for some examples. He speaks with wisdom and experience and a little bit of dark humour, and his dialogue is really easy to pick out on the page. That's definitely the effect you want to shoot for, and I've noticed that an issue with newer writers' work, and I've seen it in my own writing too, is that sometimes dialogue can feel like it's just there to be a building block in the story and to serve no other purpose. When that happens, all the dialogue tends to sound pretty much the same no matter what character is speaking. There's no real sense of character because the dialogue has been written just to move the story along. It's an easy trap to fall in, but I think the way to avoid it is to keep in mind that dialogue should always be an extension of your character as well. It's there to give us an insight into who our characters are, not just what they're doing. Here's an example of some dialogue from No Country between Sheriff Bell and one of his officers, Wendell. They found the scene of the aforementioned gunfight in the desert, and now they're trying to figure out where the survivors might have gone. This is how flat and lifeless our dialogue can be if we don't think about who our characters are as they speak, and instead just use dialogue as another building block to further the story. This is a real mess. Yes, it is. Where do you think the last man went? Wendell said. I don't know. I would guess that's what you want to know most. Yes, that's right, the sheriff said. So I've stripped the dialogue back pretty far here, and as you can see, it's pretty much impossible to tell the difference between these two characters and to tell who's speaking. If the two dialogue tags weren't there, we probably just wouldn't know. They use about the same diction and vocabulary. The only difference really between them is the sentence length, and that alone isn't enough to create a distinct character voice. Let's have a look at the real version from McCarthy and note the differences. It's a mess, ain't it, Sheriff? If it ain't, it'll do till the mess gets here. So where do you think this good old boy is at? Wendell said. I do not know. I would take it his whereabouts is pretty high on your work list? The sheriff nodded. Pretty high, he said. It's the same information, it's the same direction that McCarthy is pulling us in, but the difference in characterization is huge. There's still one or two dialogue tags in this exchange, but even without them, I don't think we'd have trouble telling the two characters apart. Wendell's voice is distinct because he speaks in questions. It's like he's trying to anticipate what Sheriff Bell's going to think next. It's like he wants to impress his boss in some way. His sentences also tend to be a lot longer, and he adds these unnecessary flourishes to them. Sheriff Bell, on the other hand, keeps things short and simple. He doesn't say a lot, and that naturally leads to it feeling like he speaks slower. There's so much information about these two characters in this really short exchange that again we don't even notice how McCarthy is moving the story along right in front of our eyes. The reason he's able to hide in plain sight like that is because the dialogue is about the characters and who they are as well as the situation that they're in. Dialogue can move the story forward, but it should always show us something about characters too. Think about what they say, but just as importantly, how they say it and even what they don't say. Characterization is a key way to make dialogue feel real to readers. It has to feel like a real conversation. Another way to do that is to make sure that every single character that opens their mouth has their own reasons for doing so. Every line of dialogue should carry some motivation from the character who's speaking. This is ever present in Cormac McCarthy's work, in every conversation. Even if it's a character that we only ever see once, they still want something or need something, and that's clear when they talk. There's a great example in the first few pages of No Country of how a distinct character motivation from both sides of a conversation can affect the overall tone of a scene. The book's creepy antagonist Anton Chigurh impersonates a police officer and pulls over a stranger so that he can steal his car. It's a short and simple exchange, but it becomes a conflict because of each character's distinct motivation, even though one of the characters we'll never hear from again, because he's dead. Here's how the conversation could have sounded if the spare character's motivations weren't considered at all and we only focused on the main protagonist, Anton Chigurh, and his motivations. Hello, officer. Would you step out of the car, please? Sure. The man opened the door and stepped out. Would you step away from the vehicle, please? of course. Again, I've oversimplified this dialogue to make my point, but we can see how one-sided this really feels. Shigeru wants the driver to get out the car and move away from it. His motivation is crystal clear. But the driver's dialogue has no motivation at all. He's just there to absorb Shigeru's words and be moved around like a prop on a movie set. The result of that is that there's no tension in the scene, there's no conflict, so it doesn't feel very realistic or very interesting. Again, of course, McCarthy's real version is nothing like this. The driver has his own mind and his own motivations, even though he's only got about 10 seconds to live. "What's the problem, officer?" he said. "Sir, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" The man opened the door and stepped out. "What's this about?" he said. "Would you step away from the vehicle, please?" It's not complicated, it's really simple. But now suddenly we can feel this pushback from the driver. He understandably wants to know what's going on. He has his own agenda for the conversation, which is the opposite of Shigeru's motivation, so there's tension in the scene, which Shigeru obviously ignores, which just adds to his threatening bearing. No matter how small the conversation is, remember that all the speakers in it should have something driving them. It doesn't have to be something huge or significant, but they should all want something. Otherwise, they'll feel like a cardboard cutout instead of a character. McCarthy was fantastic at building tension using dialogue, and part of the reason why is the subtext that he wove through every word that his characters spoke. Subtext is essentially the underlying meaning behind the outward-facing words. It's the difference between what a character says and what they really mean, or what they really feel. Again, there are loads of examples from No Country that I could have used, but one that stood out to me was the interaction that Shigeru has with the owner of a gas station. The subtext of this conversation is so aggressive that you can feel the gas station owner's fear as he's intimidated passively by this strange and threatening man, though the gas station owner says none of this out loud. It's that subtext. It's the fact that the real meaning or the real threat is hiding in the shadows of the conversation that makes it all the more frightening. It reminds me of every horror movie where it's reasonably scary up until the point where they show the monster and it's just a guy in a suit or a guy wearing makeup and then it's not scary anymore. Subtext creates the shadows in which monsters like Shigeru can hide. Without it, their dialogue isn't nearly as scary. Essentially, if every character just said exactly what they meant, there'd be little to no impact to dialogue, good or bad. Let's take a look at the scene. So, as Shigeru lingers in the gas station, asking the proprietor strange questions, the interaction wouldn't be nearly as unsettling without the subtext from each of the characters. In fact, it would sound something like this. "You don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about closing the store. What time do you go to bed? What a weird question, why would you ask me that? What time do you go to bed? 9:30. Would you like it if I came back and harmed you? No. I know where you live now." That exchange has more or less no subtext, and surprise, surprise, it doesn't feel like a real conversation in the slightest. The gas station owner just seems more confused than intimidated, and Shigeru seems more unhinged than threatening. Not that he isn't unhinged. But in the real version, you can hear this whole other conversation that the characters aren't having out loud. All the questions that they're not asking or not answering creates that subtext, the shadows for the monster to hide in. "I said, you don't know what you're talking about, do you? I'm talking about closing, that's what I'm talking about. What time do you go to bed?" "Sir? You're a bit deaf, aren't you? I said, what time do you go to bed?" "Well, I'd say around 9:30, somewhere around 9:30. Shigeru poured more cashews into his palm. "I could come back then," he said. "We'll be closed then." "That's alright." "Well, why would you be coming back? We'll be closed." "You said that." "Well, we will." "You live in that house behind the store?" Nothing is addressed directly here. That's what creates the subtext, and the subtext is what makes it so unnerving. The gas station owner repeats himself, which makes him seem like he's panicking, and he asks Shigeru to repeat himself by saying, "Sir," when what he really means is, "What the hell are you asking me that for?" And Shigeru says, "I could come back then," instead of saying, "I could kill you if I wanted to." Only half of that meaning is written in the words that they speak. The rest of it is in what they don't say. Try using subtext to avoid writing the obvious thing in your dialogue. And it's not all about monsters and shadows, even sarcasm or jokes can be subtext. Whatever the case, there's more to communication than just the words characters say. The real message is in what they mean. Of course, subtext isn't the only way for characters to let us know what's going on inside their head while they're speaking. There's something else. I've been doing it for this entire video. I'd say it's pretty rare for people to have a conversation keeping totally still. People create meaning with how they move, gestures that they make, or where they look. If we don't include these movements in our dialogue, then we're missing an opportunity to create more meaning for our readers. And at the same time, we're making a conversation that will feel more flat than it does real, because it's too still and static. Here's an example from the book where Sheriff Bell takes a phone call. Here's his side of the conversation with no movement and just his words alone. The phone rang. He reached and picked it up. "Sheriff Bell," he said. He listened. "Mrs. Downey, I believe he'll come down directly. Why don't you call me back in a little bit?" "Yes, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs. Downey, I haven't seen that many dead cats in trees. I think he'll come down directly if you just leave him be. You can call me back in a little bit. You hear?" From that, we can understand the conversation and we can follow it, but we don't necessarily know a huge amount about how Sheriff Bell feels. There's a little sarcasm there, for sure, but not a lot else. There's guesswork to do, because we're only seeing the words. But, once again, that's not what McCarthy wrote. Listen to the difference that even the slightest bit of movement has on this dialogue. The phone rang. He reached and picked it up. "Sheriff Bell," he said. He listened. "Mrs. Downey, I believe he'll come down directly. Why don't you call me back in a little bit?" "Yes, ma'am." He took off his hat and put it on the desk and sat with his eyes closed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs. Downey, I haven't seen that many dead cats in trees. I think he'll come down directly if you just leave him be. You call me back in a little bit, you hear?" He hung up the phone and sat looking at it. Just one or two small movements from Sheriff Bell tells us everything we need to know about how he feels. His frustration and his irritation comes out in his body language, and when you add that to the sarcasm and the forced politeness in his words, the effect is much clearer. All of these little movements are windows into the mind of your character, and they're really simple to add in. You don't have to be Cormac McCarthy to do it. Thank God. Add a little movement and some physical gestures to your characters as they speak. It's a way to elaborate on what they're saying and show the reader what they're feeling if they can't or won't say it out loud. No matter how you write your dialogue or what technique you use to bring it depth and meaning, the single most important part of writing any dialogue is knowing your characters. And I don't mean having a full 5-page bio for every single character that appears in the book. You don't have to go that far. But I think what we should do is take a moment to think about who they are, where they've come from, and where they're trying to get to. If we can do that as we write our conversations, then even bit parts like Cormac McCarthy's gas station owner will feel real because they'll have more depth. Of course, there's only so far that realistic dialogue and characters will get you if you're placing them on an empty, lifeless background. Watch this video next for my tips on making your story settings feel real and alive. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and happy writing.